Hey everyone, in light of recent events that have been going on for the past few weeks, I wanted to sit down with community members and talk about anti-blackness in the Asian community and what we can do to become better allies to the black community right now. So this is just a Zoom discussion that I had and wanted to edit and post it just so everyone can be better informed and reflect on what's been happening and what we can do to affect change in the future. So keep on watching. Thank you so much. Does everyone want to just quickly introduce themselves, like your name and where you're from and how old you are?
I'm Disha, I'm 14 and I'm from Atlanta, Georgia.
I'm Deanne Lee. I'm 17 and I'm from Huntington Beach, California.
I'm Dawn. I'm 18 and I'm from Seattle, Washington.
I'm Sam. I'm 17 and I'm from Iowa.
I'm Caitlin. I'm 17 and I live in Hong Kong.
I'm Nikita. I'm 15 and I'm from Clarksburg, Maryland.
The first question that I had was, where do you notice anti-blackness in your everyday lives perpetuated by Asians?
I know a lot of times in the South Asian community, many frown upon being a darker color of skin. So there's a lot of colorism, especially with my older relatives of my family. They frown upon being in the sun for too long.
I agree with that. And I remember being told to put turmeric on my skin to make it lighter. Now we're realizing that it's wrong, but it's still such an issue because older people don't want to change.
Last year, so Arden and I were in the same humanities class last year, and one of the units that we did was called a seat at the table. And so one of the projects one of the areas I researched was Asian American oppression and this idea of the mono minority. I think that a lot of times it just seems easier to not speak out because Asians have been perceived as this mono minority for so long.
It really started kind of in the Civil War era of the United States, where when Chinese workers came over, they were kind of the first Asians to immigrate to the United States. And I think they were seen from a worker's perspective as very docile and submissive and hardworking rather than African American slaves. Asians, when they first immigrated to the United States, kind of fell into that trap because they didn't want to be as oppressed as African Americans were back then. So they kind of used it as a way to pin the races against each other.
Also, I feel like this ties into the affirmative action whole argument and the case that was brought against Harvard. I was wondering if you had any opinions on that.
There's always going to be some sort of competition, and the reason why a lot of Asians are trying to get by with this mono minority stereotype is because if they don't fight against the system, then they don't have to burden themselves with the additional backlash that comes with it, that we often see with the Black Lives Matter movement. But recently I started noticing a progression away from that, and I've seen a lot of posts about yellow peril for Black Lives Matter, and I think it's a little bit surprising to me, but it's a good kind of surprising. I think that for so long people have just believed that in the fight for racial equality, you're kind of pitting all these different minorities against each other. There's no way to win if it's just one or the other.
We kind of buy into this system that anti-blackness is good for the Asian American community, which is really, really, really bad. Without Black Lives Matter and without Black people, as well as all people of color, no one in America is going to get true equality, and frankly in the world without that.
I think for me, something I've really struggled with the whole idea of a model minority is I feel sometimes the line is blurred, especially when talking about social justice. I love to be a leader and to stand up and speak for my community, but I never know, obviously, my privilege as a more fair-skinned Asian person, I can use that as a platform, but I also don't want to take up too much space from Black and brown people that have had different experiences. So I think it's hard sometimes, especially when I was younger, to even tell what things I had worked for and what things were just based on stereotypes, whether it was positive ones about my race and my ethnic group, or if it was more based on negative ones, you know, of like other like Black students that were going for the same opportunities or wanted to apply for the same programs.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think that's a really, really important point, and it really makes you think of how much privilege and you have as an Asian American in terms with Hispanics and African Americans too. And I think that's something that we really have to recognize and kind of use that privilege to not only stand up for those races who are currently being mistreated by police and by America's society, and also kind of learn to make way for those stories that are being told by Black people in America and listen to them and provide a platform for them to share their stories and their experiences. I think the one thing that every person can really do, it really starts in the home, like correcting your elder family if they use derogatory terms towards Black people, and just correct them on facts that they might be holding this internal prejudice against Black people, and kind of educating them about the racism that they kind of have, and if they do that. And I think it really starts at the home.
Not only should we like educate our elders about, you know, the kinds of racism that we can also like raise awareness about what's happening out there right now, the riots that are happening right now, or the protests. Like if we don't like bother correcting our elders on this, they might think it's just happening because this Black guy did something wrong. And yeah, they don't know that this Black guy was like this man, George Floyd, he was murdered at the hands of 4 other police officers, one of them who was basically one of us and did nothing. And that's basically a big issue. Fortunately for me, in my case, I was able to educate both my parents on that, and they were actually pretty shocked. And you see an Asian American officer basically just letting that happen. And I had to tell that point blank to my parents about that, and basically had to express why I felt angry towards an Asian American who may or may not have shared the same roots as me.
I think that's another important thing that you brought up, like holding people in our community, especially accountable for the actions that they've done. Like that Asian American officer, just like the other 3 officers present, just like the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck, they all deserve to be charged with murder. And I think that's another responsibility that we have, is like, instead of trying to distance ourselves from the people that are attacking the Black community and Black Lives Matter, holding them accountable and kind of just helping to make sure that we don't perpetuate that level of hate to Black Americans as well.
In a way, you really can't say, I don't claim this guy. You have to claim him and point and just like assume. Like, you can't just distance yourself as an Asian American.
I wouldn't want to immediately assume that like the Asian American officer was like just straight up like racist, but I think like going back to the idea of like this model minority and why it's been pretty difficult for like Asian American movements and Asian American like politicians and whatnot to like gain traction is because a lot of, and like I remember like the officer in the video was like a pretty, like I think he was like a man in like his like 50s or 60s. So like I feel like he probably still buys into the idea that like if I don't say anything, then the charges or like the backlash against me isn't going to be as bad. Racism and the stereotype of like being a model minority does affect people's decisions.
But I also think that whether or not he had that thought in the back of his mind isn't really something we should be concerned about, because first of all, a police officer should never, ever be, first of all, kneeling on people's necks. He wasn't resisting arrest, and his check wasn't even bad. There was nothing that George Floyd was doing wrong. I think either way, any police officer who has that job has the responsibility to serve and protect civilians, and that is really not what we're seeing, especially with the police brutality that's been happening in the past 2 weeks and the past decade, really. And I think that is something as people of color that we should be trying to bring awareness to and bring attention to.
Like, we need to try to figure out what we can do next. And right now, there are no laws saying that a police officer can be fired because they're showing racial bias. And I feel like, yeah, it might, people do think it's extreme to make that a law, but I think that it might be necessary at this point in like where we are.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think right now, because these are the same things that are happening since 1960 and in 2015 and in 2020, and this really won't stop until we do have some kind of police reform in this country.
Yeah, and I think we have to do more than this topic of like, it's come up lately of performative activism, where it's just like we're just like reposting graphics and reposting information. But I think we have to do more than that, and we have to like sign petitions, and we have to spread awareness and do as much as we can to like bring change.
I live in Des Moines, so last night there was a really bad riot, and I think like even though I do feel really helpless, I've been trying to just use social media to like get the narrative straight, and like a lot of us talked about holding people accountable, and that's important. But like, I don't know, I echo that feeling of helplessness, even though technically I could leave my home, or like we could go out and donate, but I still think like social media can be a powerful tool, and it has definitely made me feel less helpless.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of you have seen the kind of infographics of what you can do as a white person with privilege, and how to educate yourself, but do you think those are also like applicable to the Asian American community? And I'm wondering if there are any aspects of your own privilege that you recognized recently or had always been aware of.
As an Asian American, especially with things like police brutality and facing the police, I know that when I get my driver's license, I'll never have to worry that a cop will shoot me or try and wrongfully arrest me. And I think that's something that a lot of people have to be more aware of, is that because we have that privilege, we have to kind of educate non-Black Asians on why their actions perpetuate that anti-Blackness, and that education needs to come from kind of compassion and not only like speaking on Black Americans' behalfs, but empowering the voices of Black Americans and what they deal with every day. And I think a lot of that, what you said about the infographics, most of that is pretty applicable to basically any other race, especially Asian Americans. And
I think I've become more aware of like the behavior of some of my classmates. I know that like a lot of people, like Arden probably remembers that like a lot of people from my school like very openly say the N-word as like Asians, and they think that they can get away with it just because they're like minorities. Cases where I'll try to tell them to like, you know, correct their language or whatever. I think there's also like an additional, like there's this expectation that like not only should like Asian Americans or like Asian people like stay quiet about certain issues, but like especially like Asian women. I've definitely like, usually the response I'll get is like, you know, a guy will tell me to like F off or like go to the kitchen or something. And I'm always just like, okay, well then in that case, like, what's the point if I like keep telling you to try to, you know, correct your behavior and correct your language because they're like, this is a legitimate issue, and then just like have you tell me off in a way that like isn't productive for anyone. The issues that happen in the States with like race and like police brutality and anti-Blackness is so much more prevalent in the States than it is in Asia. And so I think that like this is something that I've become a little bit more aware of.
I realized like how different my life is from the life of someone who is African American. Like I realized that I don't have to worry about prejudice from police officers or passerbyers that I'm like suspicious or threatening, and I don't have to worry about doing something like making a phone call and like that being interpreted as me like holding out a gun, and I just don't have to worry about. And I also, like, kind of going off of that, I saw a few videos on IGTV that, like, Instagram videos. I saw videos of Black parents teaching their Black parents teaching their kids like how to approach the situation when they when like a police officer pulls up to them. Like they teach their kids like to put their hands up or like put their hands on the steering wheel and to like speak calmly and coherently and just convey the fact that they're not suspicious or like they shouldn't perceive as suspicious or threatening as they are by the system.
Yeah, and I wanna add to that. Like, I think like right now it's so screwed up that, you know, especially African Americans have to make a police officer feel calm and not feel threatened. And I think that is why not just like Asian Americans, but we kind of as a society have to support policy changes that combat that structural and systematic racism. Like, you know, and this escalates more to than just police reform, which is a huge part of it, but also the prison industrial complex and, you know, the criminalization of marijuana, especially that where you see Black people getting basically charged with like 50 years or like a lifetime in prison for the possession of marijuana, while you see white Americans not even being charged with it at all. And that's kind of why we have to support those policy changes and why we have to combat against that.
Yeah, going off of that, I want to bring up a fact that I learned in my English class this year. We had a unit where we talked about like identities, cultures, and different races, and we learned that white Caucasians are more likely to possess drugs, but it was 3 times. I believe it was 3 times more likely for brown or Black people to be pulled over.
Yeah, and I think as we combat that, we have to recognize that police brutality and the police force in America and, you know, the industrial prison complex, all of those are they're made from the time that they were created to be anti-Black. And I think that is something that we really have to point out moving forward, that these injustices have been happening for so many years. And we have to really reform the way that we think about the police and think about prisons as well. And we have to really resist these movements as well as this, you know, structural racism. Sorry.
Like we have been able to save this thought since like the beginning of this. So I believe we did touch on, you know, how like it's kind of like this consciousness in the back of our minds. Like, I guess if it is a stereotype, you know, keep quiet, don't make a fuss, you know, don't stir up trouble, etc. But I think at this point, since we definitely need to move away from that kind of like mentality, because in order for things to change, there has to be action. But if we Asians don't want to like act on anything because we're scared of stirring up a fight, then nothing's going to change. Like, for lack of a better word, there has to be trouble. There's gotta be trouble. There's gotta be change. We have to do something. We can't just like stay on that really, you know, stay back and watch it unfold mentality, because that's not going to change anything. Especially if you want things to change but you're not willing to do it. That's just really ironic, if not hypocritical.
I think for me, it's just all about how knowledge is power. Whether we're like setting the narrative straight, educating our own community, educating others, And just making sure it's really important to look at everything with an equitable lens and also look having an intersectional lens, and making sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable people. So obviously we're fighting for all Black folks, but also the ones that are most vulnerable. So women, Black trans folks, obviously they're at the highest risk for police brutality, wrongful arrest, things like that. So yeah, I think that's really important.
I think the fact that like Asians have been able to get away for so long with like avoiding any kind of direct social clash, in terms of like activism and protest, I think that is telling of some kind of privilege that we have. And I think that like coming from a position of privilege, it's important that we take note of these issues and that we somehow turn that privilege into like progress or some sort of change in terms of our thinking and in terms of our actions. So I think that an awareness and an accountability that we should hold ourselves to, I think that's a good place to get started. And I definitely think that's something that's come up recently. So I think that there's some hope in uniting minorities towards like a larger goal, even if that means sometimes like sacrificing like things like the things along the way, such as like college or whatever. Like at the end of the day, it's more important that we're able to get to a final position or like a final destination where we know that we can look back and be proud of the work that we've done, be proud of the change that we've pushed for, and have a future that we're inspired by and that we know we've done a good job in creating.